There is a moment, and sailors who lived through it never forgot it, when the horizon itself seemed to breathe, when the mist over the open Atlantic would shift just slightly, and from within that pale curtain of sea fog, something would emerge. Not quickly, never quickly. It came the way a storm comes, with patience, with weight, with the slow and absolute certainty that nothing in its path was going to stop it. Hundreds of feet of oak, dozens of guns on every side, flags snapping in the salt wind above it like declarations of war written in cloth, and beneath the waterline, invisible, immovable, a hull so deep and so massive that the ocean itself seemed to make room. This was the ship of the line, and for nearly 2 centuries, it was the most powerful thing human hands had ever built. To understand what the ship of the line was, you first have to understand what the sea looked like before it arrived. Because the ocean of the 1500s was not the ocean of the 1700s. It was a different world entirely, and a far more dangerous one. In the early decades of European exploration, the vessels that crossed the open Atlantic were marvels for their time, but they were, by any honest measure, small. The carrack, the caravel, the galleon. These were the workhorses of the age, nimble enough to navigate shallow coastal waters, wide enough to carry the gold and spices and timber that fueled entire empires. The Spanish galleon, in particular, had become the dominant ocean-going vessel of the 16th century. Broad in the beam, high at the stern, bristling with enough cannon to discourage most threats, it was the galleon that carried the silver of the New World back to Seville, that crossed the Pacific and the Atlantic with the treasures of conquered continents locked in its holds. And yet, the galleon had a ceiling, a limit. It was a merchant vessel wearing the costume of a warship. Formidable, yes. Fearsome, sometimes. But ultimately, it was designed to carry, not to fight, not to dominate, not to look another vessel in the eye across a mile of open water, and know without question that it would win. That ship had not yet been built. The forests of England, France, and the Netherlands held the answer, though no one knew it yet. Oak, specifically, English oak, grown over decades in the great forests of Sussex, and the New Forest, timber so dense and so hard that cannonballs had been known to glance off a well-seasoned plank rather than drive through it. It took approximately 2,000 trees, 2,000 mature, centuries-old oak trees, to build a single first-rate ship of the line. 2,000 trees felled, hauled, shaped, curved, and fitted together with a precision that modern observers find almost incomprehensible, given that the men doing it had no power tools, no steel frames, no engineering software, only knowledge, passed from master shipwright to apprentice, generation after generation, accumulated across centuries of building things that floated and things that sank, learning quietly from both. The great dockyards of Chatham and Portsmouth in England, of Brest and Toulon in France, of Amsterdam in the Dutch Republic. These were among the largest industrial complexes in the world. They smelled of pine tar and sawdust and salt. The sound of adzes and mallets carried from first light until the sun dropped below the yard walls. Teams of hundreds worked for years on a single hull. It was not construction so much as it was architecture, the architecture of war. The finished vessel, when it finally slid down the ways and settled into the harbor water, could reach 200 feet from bow to stern. It might carry 120 guns arranged across 3 entire gun decks. Each deck a long, low, thunderous corridor of iron and rope and black powder. It required a crew of 800 men simply to function, to sail it, to load it, to fight it. And when all 120 of those guns were run out, when the ports opened and the iron muzzles appeared along the side of the hull like the eyes of something ancient and enormous, the sound that followed could be heard 15 miles away. The ship of the line did not merely change naval warfare, it changed the ocean. It reorganized the great sea lanes of the world around its presence. It determined which nations could project power and which ones could not. It drew the borders of empire not on land, but on water. And it would eventually bring the lawless, golden, utterly extraordinary age of piracy. That wild century of black flags and stolen galleons and men who answered to no king, crashing to a slow, inevitable, and magnificent end. But that story takes time to tell. All the best ones do. Next, the anatomy of a floating fortress, and the world that made it necessary. Every great invention has a moment of necessity behind it. The wheel was not invented by someone with idle hands and a philosophical curiosity about circles. The printing press was not born from comfort, and the ship of the line, that vast oaken gun-bristling monument to organized violence on water, did not emerge from an era of peace. It emerged from an era of almost relentless war, of empires colliding, of trade routes worth dying for, of nations that had discovered, quite recently, that whoever controlled the sea controlled everything. The food supply, the gold, the colonies, the future. The ship of the line was the world's answer to a question that the world itself had only just learned to ask. The question was simple: how do you win? To answer it properly, we need to go back, not to the ship itself, but to the water it sailed on, to the politics of it, the hunger of it. By the early 1600s, Europe was in the grip of something unprecedented. The great oceanic discoveries of the previous century, Columbus, da Gama, Magellan, had cracked the world open like an egg, and what poured out was wealth on a scale that no generation before had ever imagined. The Americas were yielding silver and gold in quantities that staggered the mind. The spice routes of Asia were producing profits that could fund wars. Sugar, tobacco, timber, fur. Every corner of the newly mapped world was producing something that someone in Europe desperately wanted to buy. And all of it, every ounce, every bale, every crate, had to cross the ocean to get there. The nation that controlled those sea lanes controlled the world. And every major European power knew it. Spain knew it, having learned it first. England knew it, having watched Spain grow fat with American silver and decided it wanted some. France knew it, the Dutch knew it, Portugal had known it for a century already. The result was a sustained, grinding, occasionally spectacular competition for oceanic supremacy that would last from roughly 1588, the year England scattered the Spanish Armada, all the way through to the early 1800s and the age of Napoleon. 200 years of naval warfare, conducted at sea in all weathers, across every ocean on Earth. This was the world that needed a better warship, and slowly, through failure, through experiment, through battles lost and lessons learned in the worst possible way, the ship of the line was what the world produced. The name itself tells you everything. The line of battle, because this was not a ship designed for raiding, or for chasing, or for the quick, opportunistic violence of a privateer cutting out a merchant vessel in the dark. This was a ship designed to stand, to hold its position in a long, ordered formation of similar vessels, broadside to broadside with an enemy fleet, and to endure, to absorb punishment and continue delivering it, to fight, as one British admiral put it, not by brilliance, but by weight. The tactic itself, the line of battle, had emerged from the chaotic early naval engagements of the 17th century, where fleets often dissolved into shapeless melees, individual captains making their own decisions, ships firing into confusion as often as into enemies. Order, naval commanders began to realize, was a weapon in itself. If you could keep your fleet in a single, disciplined line, each ship following the one ahead of it, then the full broadside of every vessel could be brought to bear simultaneously against the enemy line. The concentrated firepower became something almost geometrically overwhelming. And so the tactics shaped the ship, and the ship in turn deepened the tactics. To fight in the line of battle, a ship had to be able to survive the line of battle. It had to carry enough guns to contribute meaningfully to the broadside. It had to be sturdy enough to absorb return fire without sinking or losing maneuverability. It had to be large enough to carry the crew, the ammunition, the provisions for months at sea, and it had to be, in some essential and not entirely rational sense, terrifying, because a fleet of ships of the line bearing down on you under full sail, their gun ports open, their flags flying, was one of the most psychologically annihilating sights the pre-industrial world could produce. The Royal Navy, with characteristic British practicality, organized all of this into a system, a rating system, and understanding it is the key to understanding the ship of the line. Ships were rated by the number of guns they carried, from the enormous first rate at the top of the scale all the way down to the modest sixth rate at the bottom. Only the top two ratings, first and second rate, were considered true ships of the line by the strictest definition, though third rates became so numerous and so capable that they served as the backbone of nearly every major engagement of the era. The first rate was the cathedral of the fleet. These were the ships that admirals flew their flags from, the ships that appeared in paintings, the ships that crowds gathered at dockyard walls to watch being launched, because the spectacle of something that size moving for the first time was simply too extraordinary to miss. A first rate carried 100 guns or more, spread across 3 full gun decks, each one a dim, low-ceilinged world of its own. All timber and rope and iron, smelling of powder and bilge water, and the particular animal warmth of hundreds of men living in close quarters. The HMS Victory, Nelson's flagship at Trafalgar, and perhaps the most famous warship in history, was a first rate. She carried Duntherfer guns. She was crewed by 850 men. She displaced 3,500 tons of water when fully loaded. She cost, in the money of her time, the equivalent of what a small nation might spend on its entire army for a year. The second rate was nearly as formidable, typically carrying between 90 and 98 guns on 3 decks, and shared all the grandeur and most of the fighting power of its larger cousin. What it lacked, marginally, in prestige, it compensated for in number. Second rates formed the heavy muscle of a fleet, reliable and devastating, but it was the third rate, the 74-gun ship specifically, that became the true workhorse of the age. Naval historians speak of the 74 the way automotive historians speak of the Model T. It was the design that worked. It carried enough guns to fight in any line of battle. It was fast enough, when the wind cooperated, to catch almost anything it needed to catch. It was manageable enough to be crewed effectively, without the extraordinary logistical demands of a first rate. And it could be built, relatively speaking, quickly enough to be produced in meaningful numbers. The 74 was the answer to every admiral's prayer, the ship that was excellent at everything without being impossible at anything. Now, step aboard. Not as an admiral, not even as an officer. Step aboard as an ordinary man of the 18th century, perhaps pressed into service in a Portsmouth tavern on a winter evening, waking up the next morning on a vessel already at sea, and suddenly, profoundly part of a world unlike anything you had ever known. The first thing you notice is the size. From the outside, standing on the dock, a ship of the line looks enormous. From the inside, it feels simultaneously even larger and impossibly cramped. The lower gun deck, the deepest of the fighting decks, closest to the waterline, stretches the length of the ship in near darkness, its ceiling so low that a tall man must duck to walk it. The guns crouch there in their carriages like sleeping animals, 1,400 pounds of iron each, lashed tight against the hull with heavy rope when not in action. Between the guns, The crew eats, sleeps, plays cards, repairs rope, argues, sings, prays, and counts the days until the voyage ends. Each man has roughly 14 inches of hammock space, 14 inches in which to sleep. The smell, after weeks at sea, defies adequate description. Above the lower gun deck is the middle gun deck. Above that, the upper gun deck, brighter now, with daylight filtering through the open ports. Above that still, the weather deck, the open top of the ship, exposed to sky and wind and sea and spray, where the great masts rise and the rigging spreads outward and upward in a web of hundreds of lines, each one with a name, each one with a function, each one tended by men who had learned to climb them in any weather, at any hour, in conditions that would paralyze most human beings with raw fear. The masts themselves are engineering achievements of startling ambition. The mainmast of a first rate, the tallest of the three, could reach 200 feet above the waterline. It was not a single piece of timber. No tree grew that straight or that tall. It was a composed mast, multiple sections of the finest pine or spruce, fitted together with iron bands and rope, engineered to bend slightly under the pressure of the sails above it, rather than snap. The sails, acres of canvas when fully deployed, could drive this floating fortress of 2,000 tons through the water at 8, 9, sometimes 10 knots in a favorable wind. Not fast by any modern standard, but quietly, persistently, inexorably relentless, in the way that only very large, very heavy things moving with purpose can be. And so here it is. This is the machine. 2,000 trees, 800 men, 100 guns, months at sea, a world of salt and timber and black powder and rope, governed by a hierarchy as rigid as anything on land, fueled by hardtack and salt meat and whatever rum the purser had seen fit to allocate. It was brutal. It was magnificent. It was, by any honest accounting, one of the most complex human organizations that the pre-industrial world had ever attempted to sustain. And it was about to change everything, because out there, beyond the horizon, in the warm Caribbean waters, on the trade routes between continents, in the shipping lanes where fortunes crossed the sea in wooden hulls, there was another world that had grown up in the space the great navies had not yet thought to fill. A world of men who answered to no flag, who sailed under their own laws, in ships they had taken rather than built, by methods the respectable world preferred not to discuss in polite company. The golden age of piracy was not an accident of history. It was a consequence, a shadow cast by the very empires that would eventually destroy it. And the ship of the line, patient, inevitable, all but unstoppable, was already on its way. There is a particular kind of freedom that only exists at the edges of maps. In the 16th and 17th centuries, the edges of maps were everywhere. The Caribbean Sea, that warm, island-scattered, impossibly blue expanse between the Americas, was one of the great edges. It was far from the capitals of Europe, far from their courts and their laws and their customs, houses and their priests. The ships that crossed it were sometimes gone for a year or more before anyone in London or Seville or Amsterdam even knew they had left. Out there, in those waters, the usual rules applied only loosely, and everyone who sailed them, merchants, naval officers, colonial governors, and a rapidly growing population of men who defied easy categorization, understood this implicitly. The pirates understood it better than anyone. But to understand how piracy became what it became, how it grew from an opportunistic nuisance into a genuine geopolitical problem, a subculture with its own codes and its own economy and its own mythology, you first have to understand the single most important and most conveniently forgotten truth about the golden age of piracy. The great empires of Europe did not merely fail to stop piracy in its early decades. In many cases, they funded it. The mechanism was called privateering, and it was one of the more elegant acts of officially sanctioned hypocrisy that history has to offer. Here was the logic. a nation at war. And in the 17th century, the great European powers were almost perpetually at war with someone needed to damage its enemy's trade and shipping, but maintaining a full naval presence across the entire Caribbean, the entire Atlantic, and the various other theaters of oceanic conflict was enormously expensive, even for wealthy empires. Ships cost money, crews cost money, provisioning cost money, and the return, in terms of enemy ships captured or sunk, was often frustratingly modest. The solution was to outsource the violence. A letter of marque was a government document, stamped, signed, entirely legal, that authorized a private captain to attack and plunder the shipping of a named enemy nation. In exchange, the crown received a portion of whatever the privateer captured. The privateer received the rest, along with the protection of official sanction. He was not, technically, a pirate. He was a contractor, a maritime mercenary operating with government paperwork. England used this system extensively against Spain. France used it against England. The Dutch used it against everyone who got in the way of the VOC's extraordinary commercial ambitions. For roughly a century, the privateers were the sharp, irregular, plausibly deniable edge of European naval power in the Caribbean, doing the dirty work that admiralties preferred not to be seen doing themselves. The most famous of them occupy a complicated place in history. Sir Francis Drake, hero to the English, El Drac to the Spanish, a name spoken in coastal towns of the Caribbean like a warning, raided Spanish ports and treasure fleets throughout the 1570s and 80s with the quiet blessing of Queen Elizabeth I, who publicly denied all knowledge of his activities while privately accepting a share of the plunder. Henry Morgan, operating nearly a century later, sacked the city of Panama in 1671, an act of such audacious, organized violence that it staggered contemporaries on both sides, and was subsequently arrested, sent to London to face justice, knighted by Charles II, and appointed Lieutenant Governor of Jamaica. The line between heroism and crime in this era was drawn entirely by whoever held the pen. But here is what happens when you spend decades teaching men that the sea is a place where ordinary rules do not apply, and then, inconveniently, make peace with your enemies. The letters of marque stopped coming. The treaties were signed. The wars, for the moment, ended. Spain and England shook hands. England and France drew new lines on new maps. The Dutch settled their disputes and went back to trading. And suddenly, thousands of men who had spent their working lives raiding and plundering on official government authority found themselves without employment, without income, and without any particularly compelling reason to stop doing the only thing they knew how to do. Some went home. Some found work on merchant vessels. Some drank themselves quietly into obscurity in the taverns of Port Royal and Tortuga. But some, a significant and historically consequential some, simply kept sailing. They kept taking ships. They kept dividing plunder. They kept living by the logic of the sea rather than the logic of the land. They had simply dropped the paperwork. This was the birth of the golden age of piracy. Not the romanticized version of later centuries, not the jolly flags and the buried treasure and the theatrical villainy, but the real version, the economic version, a labor surplus of skilled, violent, experienced maritime men in a part of the world where oversight was minimal, targets were plentiful, and the distance from any meaningful law enforcement was measured in months of sailing. The Caribbean of the late 17th and early 18th centuries was, in the most literal sense, a pirate's paradise, and not merely because of its beauty. Though the beauty was real, that particular shade of turquoise water over white sand that still stops people cold today. It was a paradise because of its geography. The islands of the Caribbean are numerous beyond easy counting, hundreds of them, from the large and well-known to the tiny and nameless, scattered across a sea that is simultaneously open and intimate. A small, fast vessel could disappear among those islands in hours, threading through channels too shallow for larger ships to follow, anchoring in coves that didn't appear on any chart because no one had bothered to chart them. The trade winds that swept reliably across the region made navigation predictable, which meant that anyone who understood those winds could position themselves on the routes that merchant vessels were almost certain to take. And the merchant vessels were everywhere. The Spanish treasure fleets from South America, the English sugar ships from Jamaica and Barbados, the Dutch traders moving between their island colonies, the French vessels carrying the products of Saint-Domingue. The sea lanes of the Caribbean were among the most commercially active waterways in the world, and every ship that sailed them was, from a pirate's perspective, a floating opportunity. What the pirates needed was organization. And here, the historical record produces something genuinely remarkable, because the golden age of piracy, for all its violence and lawlessness, was in many ways a surprisingly structured world. The popular image of a pirate ship as a floating anarchy, governed by the whim of a murderous captain, is largely wrong. Or rather, it was wrong for the Golden Age, whatever it may have been before or after. The pirates of this period, shaped in part by their origins as privateer crews familiar with naval discipline and maritime hierarchy, tended to operate under surprisingly formal internal agreements. Pirate articles, the contracts that governed individual ships and their crews, were written documents, negotiated and agreed upon before a voyage began. They specified how plunder would be divided. They established compensation schedules for injuries sustained in battle, a set sum for the loss of a right arm, a different sum for the left, a specified amount for an eye, for a leg, for a finger. They defined the captain's authority and, crucially, its limits. On many pirate vessels, the captain's absolute command applied only during battle. At other times, he governed by consensus, could be overruled by a vote of the crew, and could be removed from command entirely if the majority decided he was no longer fit to lead. This was not democracy in the modern sense. It was something rougher and more pragmatic. But in an era when the merchant sailor's life was characterized by brutal working conditions, arbitrary punishment, near-starvation wages, and captains who held the legal authority to flog a man within an inch of his life for the slightest infraction, the pirate ship's relative internal egalitarianism had a powerful appeal. Historians have noted, with some significance, that a great many men who joined pirate crews during this period did not do so under duress. They chose it. They chose the danger and the lawlessness because the alternative, a life of legitimate maritime labor under conditions of genuine misery, seemed, by comparison, like the worse option. The names from this period have become, in the centuries since, almost mythological, which is in itself revealing, because mythology tends to accumulate around things that touched something deep and genuine in human imagination. Blackbeard, Edward Teach, or Thatch, the historical record isn't entirely certain, operated primarily in the waters around the Carolinas and the Caribbean between 1716 and 1718. He was, by contemporary accounts, a man of considerable intelligence and even more considerable theatrical instinct. The smoking fuses he wove into his beard before battle were not, historians suspect, practical measures. They were performance. He understood, intuitively, that fear was a weapon more efficient than gunpowder, that if your reputation preceded you convincingly enough, many ships would strike their colors without a shot being fired. His career as a pirate lasted less than 2 years. In that time, he became the most famous outlaw in the Atlantic world, Bartholomew Roberts, Black Bart as he became known, though there is no evidence he ever called himself that, was by many measures the most successful pirate of the Golden Age, capturing over 400 vessels in a career of roughly 3 years. He was a teetotaler in a world of heavy drinkers. He enforced a strict code aboard his ships, including mandatory lights out at 8 in the evening. He dressed, by contemporary accounts, with extraordinary care: scarlet coat, fine hat, a diamond cross around his neck that had reportedly been intended as a gift for the King of Portugal before Roberts intervened. He was shot by grape shot from a Royal Navy vessel in 1722, and when his crew realized he was dead, many of them, overcome with grief, threw his body over the side before it could be taken. They did not want anyone to have it. Anne Bonny and Mary Red, two women who sailed and fought aboard pirate vessels at a time when women aboard ship were considered by sailors to be catastrophically bad luck, remain among the most fascinating figures of the period, not because of any particular dramatic incident in their careers, but because of what their mere existence suggests about the pirate world's capacity, under certain circumstances, to accommodate people that the legitimate world had no room for at all. But the world the pirates built was always, in a fundamental sense, borrowed time, because, even as Blackbeard terrorized the Carolina coast and Roberts plundered his way across the Atlantic, the great navies of Europe were waking up to what was happening. The merchants were complaining, loudly, persistently, to anyone with the authority to do something about it. The losses in ships and cargo were mounting. Insurance rates in London were climbing to levels that threatened to make the entire Caribbean trade economically marginal. And the governors of the Caribbean colonies, men who had, in many cases, quietly benefited from pirate gold flowing through their ports, were finding that the political wind had changed direction. The treaties were holding. The wars, for the moment, were over, and that meant the great warships that had been pointed at each other across fleet lines of battle were now free to be pointed somewhere else. They had a new assignment: clean up the sea. And for that assignment, there was no better instrument in the world than the one already waiting in the harbor, riding the tide with its gun ports closed and its ensign lifting in the morning wind. Patient, heavy, inevitable. The ship of the line was coming to the Caribbean. Empires are patient institutions. They can absorb a great deal. Failed harvests, incompetent ministers, expensive wars, the occasional embarrassing military defeat. What they find genuinely difficult to absorb is the persistent, daily erosion of their commercial interests. Money is the nervous system of empire. Disrupt it long enough, in enough places, and the entire body begins to feel the pain. By the second decade of the 18th century, the British Empire was in pain. The numbers tell the story with a kind of bleak clarity. Between 1706 and 1726, the peak years of what historians would later call the Golden Age of piracy, it is estimated that pirates operating in the Atlantic and Caribbean captured somewhere between 2,400 and 2,500 vessels. Not all of these were British, but enough of them were. Enough sugar ships out of Barbados, enough tobacco vessels out of Virginia, enough slave traders, which were a central and grotesque pillar of the Atlantic economy in this period. Enough of everything that the London merchant community, which had the ear of Parliament, and Parliament had the ear of the Crown, was no longer willing to absorb the losses with anything resembling equanimity. The complaints had been building for years. Now they arrived like a tide, and the Crown, which had in earlier decades found pirates occasionally useful and always easy to ignore, began to look at the problem with new and serious attention. The first instrument was not a warship. It was a piece of paper. In September of 1717, King George I issued a royal proclamation offering a full pardon to any pirate who surrendered to a British authority before the 5th of September, 1718. The terms were generous to the point of being almost startling. A clean slate, no questions about past crimes, no prosecutions for anything done before the cutoff date. The message was clear. The Crown was offering a door out of piracy, and it genuinely hoped that a significant number of men would walk through it. Many did. The lure of legitimate life, of not having to scan the horizon every morning for the silhouette of a naval vessel, was powerful enough to bring hundreds of pirates in from the warm Caribbean waters. and into the custody of various colonial governors. Blackbeard himself, Edward Teach, the most famous outlaw in the Atlantic world, accepted the pardon. He walked into the governor's office in Bath, North Carolina, surrendered formally, and was granted his freedom. He was back at sea, attacking ships, within months. Whether this represented a failure of sincerity on Blackbeard's part, or a failure of imagination about what a man like him was supposed to do with a legal life on land, is a question historians have debated ever since. Probably both. The answer is probably both. The pardon had worked partially, better than nothing, not well enough to solve the problem. And so the Crown moved to the second instrument. This one was a warship, several of them in fact. Woodes Rogers arrived in Nassau in July of 1718, aboard a vessel called the Delicia, accompanied by 2 Royal Navy frigates and a company of soldiers. Nassau, in the Bahamas, was at this point the closest thing the golden age of piracy had to a capital city. The harbor was full of pirate vessels. The taverns were full of pirate crews. The entire island operated on an informal economy built around plunder, with a local population that had long since made its peace with the arrangement, because the arrangement, however disreputable, paid reasonably well. Rogers was a remarkable man, for a remarkable assignment. He had himself, years earlier, been a privateer. He was the man who rescued Alexander Selkirk from the island of Juan Fernandez in 1709, the marooned sailor whose story would eventually inspire Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe. He understood the maritime world he was walking into. He understood its logic and its people. And he arrived with something more valuable than military force alone. He arrived with the pardon, and with enough naval firepower behind him to make the alternative to the pardon very clear. Most of the pirates in Nassau accepted the offer. They stood on the beach or in the harbor and took the king's pardon, and Rogers accepted their surrender with the efficiency of a man who had other things to attend to. A small number refused. 3 of them were tried, convicted, and hanged from a specially constructed gallows overlooking the harbor. Their bodies left to swing in the salt wind as a declaration of the new arrangement. Rogers's famous motto, which he had coined himself and which would later become the official motto of the Bahamas, was Expulsus Piratus, Restituta Commercia. The pirates expelled, commerce restored. It was a mission statement as much as a motto, and it was, in the Caribbean, the beginning of the end. But Nassau was an island, one harbor, one beach, one set of gallows. The Caribbean was thousands of square miles of open water, dotted with hundreds of islands, threaded with channels and coves that no official chart fully described. Cleaning it up, actually cleaning it, systematically, permanently, was a different kind of problem. It required not just political will and the occasional exemplary execution. It required sustained naval presence, ships, and enough of them in the right places for long enough that the calculus of piracy simply stopped making sense. Here is where the ship of the line's role becomes subtler and more interesting than the simple image of a massive warship blowing a pirate sloop out of the water. The truth is that a first-rate ship of the line was, in many ways, poorly suited to the actual work of hunting pirates. It drew too much water to follow a small vessel into shallow coastal waters. It was too large and too slow to chase a nimble sloop through an island archipelago. Its crew was too numerous, its maintenance too demanding, its logistical requirements too vast for the kind of patient, flexible, prolonged patrol work that Caribbean anti-piracy operations actually required. What the Royal Navy sent to the Caribbean in meaningful numbers were not ships of the line. They were frigates and sloops of war, smaller, faster, shallower drafted vessels that could follow a pirate into waters a first-rate would never dare enter. These were the hunting dogs of the fleet, lean, purposeful, quick. But the ship of the line stood behind them, And this is the crucial point that naval historians sometimes understate. The great first rates and third rates of the Royal Navy did not need to enter every shallow cove or chase every pirate sloop to change the nature of piracy fundamentally. They simply needed to exist and to be present in the theater of operations in sufficient numbers, because the presence of a fleet, even a fleet anchored in Port Royal or Bridgetown, even a fleet that a pirate captain had no intention of directly engaging, changed the entire strategic environment. It closed major harbors to pirate use. It made the resupply of pirate vessels progressively more difficult. It put colonial governors on notice that the days of quiet accommodation with local pirates were finished. It made the Atlantic trade lanes more heavily patrolled and therefore less profitable to attack. And it sent a signal, wordless, enormous, impossible to misread, that the era of official tolerance was over. The ship of the line was a statement as much as it was a weapon, and in the age of sail, statements made in oak and iron and 100 guns were remarkably hard to argue with. The end came for the great pirates, not all at once, but in a series of separate, decisive moments scattered across a handful of years that collectively amounted to a collapse. Blackbeard was killed in November of 1718, 2 months after Rogers arrived in Nassau, and roughly a year after his pardon, in a fight of almost theatrical violence in the shallow waters of Ocracoke Inlet on the North Carolina coast. Lieutenant Robert Maynard of the Royal Navy had tracked him down with 2 small sloops, the kind of vessel suited to exactly that kind of coastal work, and the engagement that followed was brief, brutal, and personal in a way that fleet battles never were. The 2 men fought hand to hand on the deck of Blackbeard's vessel, the Adventure. Blackbeard, by accounts gathered afterward from survivors on both sides, sustained 5 bullet wounds and approximately 20 sword cuts before he finally went down. Maynard had his head removed, hung it from the bowsprit of his sloop, and sailed back to port with it as proof. The effect on the pirate world was significant, not because Blackbeard had been the most operationally important pirate of the age. Bartholomew Roberts, by any measure of ships taken and damage done, far exceeded him, but because Blackbeard had been the most visible, the most mythologized. If the Royal Navy could track down and kill Edward Teach in a North Carolina backwater, the message was plain. There was no corner of the Atlantic world far enough from reach anymore. Stade Bonnet, the so-called gentleman pirate, a Barbadian sugar planter of genuine wealth who had, in one of history's more baffling career changes, simply purchased a ship and turned pirate, apparently to escape an unhappy marriage, was captured, tried, and hanged in Charleston, South Carolina, before the year was out. The net was drawing tighter. Bartholomew Roberts held out longer than any of them. He was, in purely professional terms, extraordinary. A natural navigator, a disciplined commander, a man of genuine tactical intelligence who seemed almost constitutionally incapable of fear. He continued operating across the Atlantic and Caribbean for years after the great campaign against piracy had begun, taking ship after ship with an efficiency that infuriated the Royal Navy and dismayed the merchant community. At various points his fleet numbered several vessels. His crews were large and experienced. He operated across a range, from the Caribbean to the West African coast, that made systematic pursuit genuinely difficult. But HMS Swallow found him. The Swallow was a 50-gun fourth-rate vessel, not a ship of the line in the strictest sense of fleet battle, but a substantial warship by any other measure, well-armed, well-crewed, commanded by a Captain Challoner Ogle, who was methodical and patient and had spent considerable time learning Roberts's patterns of movement. Off the coast of West Africa, near Cape Lopez, on the morning of February 10, 1722, the Swallow came around a headland and found Roberts's fleet at anchor. Roberts was, by many accounts, eating breakfast. The engagement that followed was not long. Roberts himself was killed early. A burst of grape shot across the deck, and the most successful pirate of the Golden Age was simply gone, dropped by the kind of impersonal, scattershot violence that took no account of reputation or legend. His crew, true to their articles, threw his body overboard before the ship was boarded. Ogle captured the rest. A subsequent trial in Cape Coast Castle convicted 52 of Roberts's crew of piracy. 52 of them were hanged. It was the single largest mass execution of pirates in the history of the Atlantic world, and it was, for most practical purposes, the end. The golden age of piracy did not conclude with a single dramatic moment. It faded, the way all ages fade, through accumulation, through enough hanged men, enough captured ships, enough harbors closed, enough pardons offered and accepted, enough naval patrols making the open sea a less hospitable place for those who had built their lives on its lawlessness. By the mid-1720s, the numbers had collapsed. Ships taken per year dropped from the hundreds to the dozens to something that barely registered. The pirates who remained were increasingly marginal figures, smaller crews, smaller ships, operating in more remote waters with diminishing returns. The great network of pirate ports and informal supply chains that had sustained the Golden Age had been systematically dismantled. The colonial governors who had winked at the arrangement had been replaced, retired, or warned with sufficient clarity that the winking was no longer wise. The sea was not yet safe. It would never be entirely safe. Pirates would persist in one form or another for as long as there were ships worth taking. But the age of piracy, that extraordinary, violent, briefly luminous period when the ocean's edges belonged to men who answered to nobody, was finished. And in its place, moving through the deep water where pirate sloops had once scattered at the first sight of a sail, were the great ships, heavy, purposeful, flying the flags of kings. The ocean, for better or worse, had been claimed. There is a particular kind of silence that falls before catastrophic violence. Soldiers who have experienced it describe it in almost identical terms, across centuries and across cultures. A stillness that has texture to it, a quiet that feels less like the absence of sound and more like the world holding its breath. It happens before the artillery opens, before the cavalry charges, before the gates are breached. At sea, in the age of sail, that silence had its own specific character. It lasted longer than it did on land, because ships moved slowly, and a fleet battle could be visible, could be known to be coming. For hours before it arrived, you could stand on the weather deck of a ship of the line in the early morning and watch the enemy fleet on the horizon, 10 miles away, a dark line of hulls and masts against the pale sky, and know with complete certainty that by afternoon the world would be entirely different, that men currently eating their breakfast, checking their rigging, saying quiet things to themselves or to God, would by sunset be dead or wounded or victorious or defeated or drifting on wreckage in a sea still grey with gun smoke. You knew, you just had to wait for it to arrive. This waiting was, by many accounts, the worst part. To understand what fleet battle actually was, what it looked, sounded, smelled, and felt like, you have to first understand what it was not. It was not the swashbuckling individual combat of popular imagination. It was not captains dueling on quarterdeck while their crews cheered. It was not fast or glamorous or particularly distinguishable from the middle of it as anything other than a sustained and overwhelming assault on every human sense simultaneously. A fleet engagement between two lines of ships of the line was an industrial event, a manufacturing process, almost. The mass production of destruction at close range, sustained over hours, by thousands of men performing repetitive, specialized, physically punishing tasks in conditions of almost incomprehensible noise and danger. The great fleet battles of the 18th century, the glorious 1st of June in 1794, Cape Saint-Cyr, Vincent in 797, the Nile in 798, Trafalgar in 1805, were not won by heroism alone, though heroism was present in quantities that strained belief. They were won by organization, by training, by the capacity of a crew to keep loading and firing their guns at a rate of once every 90 seconds per gun for 2 and 3 and 4 hours at a stretch, while the ship around them was being simultaneously dismantled by enemy fire. This was what the Royal Navy trained for, relentlessly, in the long stretches between engagements. Gun drill. Over and over. Load, run out, fire, run in, swab, load, until the sequence was not thought about, but simply done, the body performing it independently of whatever the mind was occupied with, which, in battle, was usually fear. Step now to the gun deck. It is somewhere in the late afternoon of October the 21st, 1805. The position is roughly 18 miles southwest of Cape Trafalgar, on the southern coast of Spain. The combined fleet of France and Spain, 33 ships of the line, carrying somewhere between 2,600 and 2,700 guns, is formed in a ragged line running roughly north to south. The British fleet of 27 ships is approaching it from the west, not in the conventional parallel line that the formal tactics of the era prescribed, in 2 columns, directly toward the enemy line, perpendicular to it. This was Nelson's decision. It was, on paper, an act of dangerous audacity, because approaching Bow first meant that the leading British ships could not bring their broadsides to bear for the entire duration of the approach, while the French and Spanish ships could fire at them freely. The leading vessels would take punishment for 20 minutes or more before they could fight back. Men would die during that approach in numbers that could not be prevented. Nelson had calculated this. He had calculated it coldly and accepted it, because what happened after the British columns broke through the enemy line made the losses during the approach worthwhile. Once through, the French and Spanish line was cut into 3 sections, none of which could easily support the others. Individual British ships, faster and more accurately gunned, would wrap around individual enemy ships and fight them at ranges close enough, in some cases, that the gun muzzles almost touched the enemy hull. The tactical advantage would be enormous. The cost of getting there would be real and would be paid in blood. His captains trusted him enough to sail into it. The gun deck of HMS Victory, as she approached the combined fleet, was a world of controlled, near religious intensity. The guns had been loaded hours earlier. The decks had been wetted and sanded. Wet to reduce fire risk from sparks, sanded to give the gun crews traction because the decks would shortly be slippery with blood. The ship's surgeon, Dr. Remble, William Beatty, had set up his operating station in the all-up deck below the waterline, well below the gun decks, in the dimness and relative protection of the lowest part of the ship. His instruments were laid out. His assistants were ready. There was nothing more to do but wait for the wounded to arrive, which they would, with a speed and volume that the human mind prefers not to dwell on at length. The men at the guns were, for the most part, not British. The Victory's crew, like the crew of most Royal Navy ships of the period, was a composite of nationalities drawn from every maritime nation in the world. English, Irish, Scottish, Welsh, American, West Indian, Scandinavian, Portuguese, even a handful of Frenchmen fighting under British colours. What united them was not nationality but profession. They were sailors. They understood the ship around them with the intimacy of people who lived and worked within it every hour of every day for months at a stretch. They knew every sound it made in different winds. They knew its moods, the way a farmer knows his land. And now they stood at their guns in the half-light of the closed gun deck, listening to the sound of enemy fire beginning to strike the hull. A series of impacts that registered less as explosions and more as deep, structural jolts, the ship shuddering around them, and waited for the order to open the ports. When it came, the noise was unlike anything that can be adequately described in calm prose. The broadside of a first-rate ship of the line firing simultaneously was not a sound so much as a physical event. It was felt in the chest, in the teeth, in the bones. The concussion of 30 or more large-caliber cannon firing in rapid succession was sufficient to be heard, on a calm day, 15 miles away. On the gun deck itself, the noise was so total and so absolute that communication became impossible. Officers relied on gesture, on prearranged signals, on the simple fact that the crew knew their jobs well enough not to require instruction during the engagement itself. The guns recoiled enormously on their carriages, rolling back several feet on the deck before being checked by the breaching ropes. They had to be swabbed immediately. A wet sponge rammed down the barrel to extinguish any remaining sparks before the next cartridge was loaded, because a spark in an unswabbed barrel when the new powder charge arrived was not a problem that anyone survived. Then the cartridge, a pre-measured charge of black powder in a flannel bag, was loaded, followed by the shot, and then the whole assembly was rammed tight. The gun was then run out again through the port, a process requiring several men on the side tackles, hauling the carriage forward until the muzzle projected through the opening. And then the gunner applied the slow match or the flintlock mechanism to the touch hole at the rear, and the process repeated. 90 seconds for a well-drilled crew. For hours, in smoke so dense that by the middle of a sustained engagement, the gun crews often could not see the ship they were firing at, or even, in some cases, the port they were firing through. They loaded and fired in the direction they had been pointed when the action began, trusting that the enemy was still more or less there. The great fleet engagements of the age produced strategic consequences that reshaped the world's map, sometimes quite literally. To understand this, you need to hold two things simultaneously in your mind: the intimate, personal, almost unbearably human scale of what happened on those gun decks, and the vast geopolitical scale of what those hours of violence determined. At the Battle of the Nile, fought in August of 1798, in Aboukir Bay on the Egyptian coast, Rear Admiral Horatio Nelson, commanding a fleet of 14 ships of the line, attacked a French fleet of 17 ships under Vice Admiral François-Paul Bruys de Galliers that was at anchor in what Bruys believed was an unassailable defensive position. Nelson's captains, operating with a latitude and initiative that was remarkable even for the Royal Navy, made the decision to attack on both sides of the anchored French line simultaneously, sending some ships inside the line between the French fleet and the shoal water, while others attacked from the seaward side. The result was the virtual destruction of the French fleet. 11 of the 17 French ships were captured or destroyed. The flagship L'Orhel, one of the largest warships in the world at the time, caught fire during the battle and exploded with a blast so enormous that both fleets ceased firing, stunned into momentary silence by the scale of it. The explosion could be heard in Alexandria, 12 miles away. Every man on both sides who described it afterward reached for the same language, that it was unlike anything else, that it was something outside the category of normal experience. The strategic consequence of the Nile was the isolation of Napoleon's army in Egypt, the elimination of French naval power in the Mediterranean, and the effective end of Napoleon's ambitions in the Middle East. A single afternoon of battle in an Egyptian bay, fought by men who would mostly never see France or England again, who spent the night after the engagement tending their wounded and throwing their dead into water still burning with floating debris from Lorient, had rearranged the strategic map of an entire region. This was what ships of the line did when they met each other. They decided things, large things, permanent things. Trafalgar, 7 years later, decided the largest thing of all. By October of 1805, Napoleon Bonaparte had constructed the most powerful land army in the history of Europe and had positioned it at Boulogne on the French coast, within sight of the English cliffs on a clear day. His plan for the invasion of Britain was real, detailed, and militarily credible. What it required was control of the English Channel for long enough, a matter of days, perhaps even hours, to get his troops across. What it required, in other words, was for the Royal Navy to be elsewhere or destroyed. Cape Trafalgar ended that possibility permanently. The combined Franco-Spanish fleet that Nelson destroyed that afternoon was the last serious French naval challenge to British oceanic supremacy. Of the 33 ships that the combined fleet brought to the battle, 18 were captured or destroyed. Britain lost none. The victory was so complete, so decisive, that Napoleon never again seriously contemplated naval challenge to British power. He turned instead to the continent, to land war, to the long grinding campaign that would eventually consume his empire from within. Britain would rule the seas for the next century. The trade routes were secure, the colonies were reachable, the empire could breathe. Nelson himself did not live to see the full scope of what he had accomplished. He was struck by a musket ball from the mizzen top of the French ship Redoutable at approximately 1025 in the afternoon as he paced the quarterdeck of the Victory during the height of the engagement. The ball entered his left shoulder, passed through his spine, and lodged in the muscles of his back. He was carried below to the orlop deck, to the same dim space where Dr. Tem Beatty had set up his surgery and laid among the wounded. He knew immediately, from the character of the pain and the paralysis below it, that the wound was fatal. He lived for 3 more hours, long enough to know that the battle was won. He was 47 years old. What do you make of a world where a single afternoon on the water could determine the fate of continents, where the death of one man on one quarterdeck could be simultaneously a personal tragedy of the most intimate kind and a fact of world historical significance? You make of it what every generation since has made of it. You stand before it in something that is not quite admiration and not quite horror, and is probably, if you are being honest with yourself, something of both, because that is what the ship of the line demands of us. It was a machine of war without apology or softness, and within it, and around it, and because of it, human beings, in all their terror and courage and grief and endurance and extraordinary, improbable capability for organized action, did things that the world has never quite stopped talking about. Nor should it. There is something the history books tend to understate. They give us the battles. They give us the admirals and the tactics and the broadsides and the strategic consequences. They give us Trafalgar and the Nile and the great fleet engagements that reshaped continents. And all of it is true, and all of it deserves the telling. But in concentrating on what ships of the line did to each other, history has a tendency to overlook the thing that destroyed more of them than enemy fire ever did: the sea itself. Not enemy cannon, not French grape shot or Spanish chain shot or the massed broadside of a rival fleet. The ocean, indifferent, enormous, ungoverned by any treaty or any admiral's orders, claimed more ships of the line than all the wars of the Age of Sail combined. It claimed them in storms off Cape Finisterre and on the rocks of the Scilly Isles and in the impossible weather systems of the South Atlantic. It claimed them through exhaustion and through error and through the simple, brutal fact that no matter how well you built a wooden ship, no matter how many oak trees you felled and shaped and fitted together with iron and rope and human ingenuity, you were still, in the end, putting a box of wood into an environment that had no particular interest in keeping it afloat. The sea was not an enemy in any meaningful sense. It had no intention, no malice. It simply was, vast and physical and subject to forces that no 18th century navigator, however gifted, could fully predict or control. And that utter indifference was, in many ways, more terrifying than anything an enemy fleet could offer. An enemy fleet, at least, you could see coming. To understand what a storm meant to a ship of the line, you need to first understand what sailing one in fair weather required. In a reasonable wind and a cooperative sea, the management of a large warship was already a task of sustained, demanding complexity. The sails had to be constantly adjusted to the wind, too much canvas in a freshening breeze, and the masts were at risk. Too little and you lost way, fell off course, became vulnerable. The rigging required continuous inspection and repair, because rope under tension in salt air deteriorated with a patience testing persistence. The hull required monitoring for leaks, which were constant on any wooden ship, and which could accelerate alarmingly if the vessel was working hard in a seaway, flexing and twisting in the waves in ways that opened seams and strained caulking and let the dark water in, slow at first, then faster. None of this was optional. None of it could be deferred. The sea did not pause while you attended to something else. Now add a storm, not the moderate gales that every ship of the line encountered regularly and handled with relative routine, though even these demanded everything from the crew. Add a real storm, the kind that the North Atlantic and the Bay of Biscay produced with a frequency that the logs of the period record with a kind of exhausted familiarity. A storm that built over 2 days and arrived in the night when visibility was nothing and the wind had climbed past anything the instruments could reliably measure. A storm where the waves were not waves in any ordinary sense, but moving walls of water 40 feet high, approaching out of the darkness with a sound like continuous thunder, striking the hull with impacts that sent men sliding across wet decks and tore the hands of those gripping the lines. In these conditions, the priority was not fighting. It was not navigation in any precise sense. It was survival, pursued with total concentration and a kind of desperate creativity. Sails were reduced to almost nothing, sometimes to bare poles, the masts stripped of canvas entirely. The helm was lashed to keep the ship from broaching, turning sideways to the waves, which was a death sentence, because a broadside wave of sufficient size could roll a ship of the line far enough to ship water through the gun ports and capsize her. The pumps ran continuously, worked by relays of exhausted men, because no hull in a violent sea was fully watertight, and the water had to go somewhere. Officers walked, when walking was possible, calculating and recalculating their position with instruments that could barely function in the motion and the spray, trying to determine where the nearest coast was and whether they had sea room enough to survive the night. Often they did. The men who built and sailed these ships were not without resource or courage or skill, and the survival rate of large warships in even severe weather was, on balance, better than the stories suggest. But not always. On the 22nd of October, 1707, one of the darker dates in British naval history, 4 ships of the line and a fireship struck the rocks of the Scilly Isles in the darkness after a sustained period of bad weather and navigational uncertainty. The Flagship Association, carrying Rear Admiral Sir Cloudesley Shovel, went down in minutes after striking. Shovel himself was drowned, along with somewhere between 1,400 and 2,000 sailors. The historical record is imprecise, which is itself a kind of indictment of how the era counted its maritime dead. The disaster had a cause beyond the immediate one of rocks in the dark. It was a navigation problem. Specifically, it was the problem that had plagued maritime nations since the first ship ever lost sight of land, the problem of longitude. In 77, a navigator at sea could determine his latitude, his north-south position, with reasonable accuracy using the stars and a quadrant. What he could not determine with any reliability was his longitude, his east-west position. The instruments and mathematical methods existed for latitude. For longitude, in the early 18th century, there was essentially nothing. You estimated, based on speed and heading and time elapsed, and you were frequently wrong, and sometimes catastrophically so. The Scilly disaster shocked the British government into action. In 1714, Parliament passed the Longitude Act, offering a prize of £20,000, a sum of extraordinary magnitude, to anyone who could devise a reliable method of determining longitude at sea. The story of what followed, of John Harrison's decades-long, obsessive, ultimately triumphant development of the marine chronometer is one of the great human persistence stories of the 18th century. Harrison's clock, accurate enough to hold its rate at sea over months of rolling and temperature change and salt air, gave navigators longitude for the first time. It made the oceans safer, in a way that no amount of gunnery or naval tactics could have. The sea had demanded the invention, and the invention changed everything. But if storms and navigation were the great impersonal killers, there was another enemy that operated with an insidious patience even more lethal than either: disease. Scurvy, specifically, the slow, grinding, entirely preventable consequence of a diet without vitamin C, which the long voyage diet of salt meat and hardtack was entirely unable to provide. A sailor with scurvy became progressively weaker and more exhausted. His gums swelled and bled. His old wounds reopened as the connective tissue that had healed them broke down. His joints ached with a persistent severity that made sleep impossible. He became, over weeks, a man who could barely stand, and then a man who could not stand, and then, if the voyage did not end or the diet did not change, a man who did not survive. The statistics are nearly impossible to absorb with equanimity. In some extended naval campaigns of the 18th century, scurvy killed more men than enemy action by ratios of 5 to 1, 10 to 1. The Royal Navy lost thousands of sailors to scurvy in the wars of the mid-18th century. Men who had survived storms and battles, and the grinding physical demands of life at sea, undone finally by the absence of a lemon. James Lind, a Scottish naval surgeon, demonstrated the citrus cure in 1747 in one of the earliest controlled clinical trials in medical history. It took the Royal Navy another 40 years to formally adopt citrus juice as a standard issue item, a delay that condemned an unknowable number of men to deaths that were, in every meaningful sense, unnecessary. When the Navy finally acted, the results were immediate and dramatic. Scurvy, which had been a routine and expected feature of extended voyages, essentially disappeared from British ships within a generation. The ships of the line became, in this one specific way, dramatically more capable, not because the ships themselves had changed, but because the men inside them were no longer dying of a preventable deficiency. And as the ocean had not changed, the enemy had not changed. Only the understanding had. By the early decades of the 19th century, the ship of the line stood at the absolute apex of what wooden naval architecture could achieve. The vessels launched in the 1800s and 1810s were in many ways superior to anything that had preceded them. Better designed, better armed, better provisioned, crewed by men whose health and survival rate were dramatically improved over their predecessors. The accumulated knowledge of 2 centuries of building and sailing and fighting and losing these ships had produced something very close to perfection within the constraints of the medium, and the medium itself was about to become obsolete. Steam had been powering things on land since the 1780s. The transition to steam power at sea was slower and less dramatic, but it was inevitable, and by the 1840s it was clearly underway. Iron hulls, screw propellers, engines that did not require the wind to function, that were indifferent to the direction of the weather, that could drive a vessel at a reliable speed regardless of what the atmosphere chose to do that day. The strategic implications were enormous. A steam-powered warship could maneuver independently of the wind, could choose its angle of attack without waiting for the right breeze. The entire tactical system of the age of sail, built around the wind as the fundamental limiting and enabling force, began to dissolve. HMS Warrior, launched in 1860, was an iron-hulled, steam-powered armored warship that made every wooden ship of the line in the world simultaneously obsolete. She was not herself entirely without sail. She carried a full sailing rig in addition to her engines, a transitional concession to the conservatism of the institution, but she was the beginning of the end of something. Everyone who saw her understood this, even if they could not always articulate it. The last ship of the line to serve as a frontline warship in the Royal Navy was decommissioned in the 1860s. The great oak forests of England and France and the Dutch Republic, which had fed the building yards for 2 centuries, were allowed finally to grow without purpose. The master shipwrights, whose knowledge had been passed generation to generation, the knowledge of how to weed a timber, and how to cut a frame, and how to fit 2,000 trees into something that would float and fight. That knowledge, within a single generation, became history. What remains? A handful of ships preserved against the entropy that claims everything else. HMS Victory sits in a dry dock in Portsmouth, England, the same ship that led the weather column at Trafalgar, the same ship whose gun decks Nelson walked on the morning of the battle, the same ship on whose orlop deck he died. She has been restored and maintained and visited by millions of people who stand on her gun decks and try to imagine what it was, what it truly was, to exist in this space when the guns were running out and the smoke was filling the air and the world was entirely noise and violence and the absolute necessity of continuing to function. Most of them, standing there, find that the imagination falls short, that there is something in the reality of it that exceeds what the mind can fully reconstruct from the evidence available. This is perhaps as it should be. Some things that human beings have done and endured and created and survived deserve to remain, at least partially, beyond the reach of easy comprehension. They deserve to attain a residue of the incomprehensible, to sit in the mind like a weight that cannot quite be lifted, a question that cannot quite be answered. The ship of the line was built by hand, from trees, by men whose names are mostly forgotten. It was sailed by men whose lives were hard in ways that resist romantic description. It fought battles that determined the shape of the modern world. It was undone, finally, not by any enemy but by time, by the forward movement of human ingenuity that it had itself, in some ways, helped to fund and protect. It is gone now. The age it dominated is gone. The ocean it sailed is the same ocean, but the world around it is unrecognizable. And yet, stand at a harbor on a grey morning with a wind coming in from the southwest and the smell of salt in the air, and something in the quality of the light, something in the sound the water makes against stone, will pull at you, quietly, insistently, the way old things pull at us when we allow ourselves to be still enough to feel it. It is not nostalgia exactly. It is something older than nostalgia. It is the knowledge that the sea was here before us, and that people crossed it in wooden ships and did extraordinary things, and that the distance between their world and ours is both vast and, in some essential and unquantifiable way, not quite as vast as it appears. The ships are gone. The ocean remembers.